everybody. Hi, 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 hi. Okay, so I'm driving. I have to do an errand before I go into the office, but all I can say is wow, 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 and wow. First, to all of those who know what this is, I guess I don't know if I'd call it Happy Juneteenth Day, but it was supposed to be the official emancipation of slaves, although it took quite some time for enslaved people to find out that they were actually free, because we did not have the technology then that we have now in terms of phones and internet and things of that nature. So, and what better way to address the conversation or open this, what better day to open the discussion about reparations for people of color, or ADOS, African descendants of slavery. I can only say this, you guys, and I don't want to go through everything because I believe the whole entire, let's put it this way, I recommend everybody have the opportunity to look at the video that was posted today as it relates to the discussions around reparations for African Americans. I recommend every single person take the time, white, black, Asian, Indian, old, young, everyone, take the time to check it out. Everyone. The discussions were powerful. The data was factual. The truth was repeated over and over again in many ways and many different forms. And it speaks not only to our past, it speaks to our present, and it speaks to how we rectify or repair the future of people of color in this country. John Henry Clark had made reference in one of his speeches to restoring what we had lost. We can never begin to rationalize or justify or explain away or completely heal the idea that human beings were literally ripped from their homeland, ripped. Hi Chandra, how are you? Hope everybody's doing okay back home in Bermuda. What I was sharing about was reparations and the discussion, the committee to discuss reparations, or at least consider putting together a commission about the reparations for African Americans in this country. And I was saying how impressed I was with the discussion, with how well it rolled out, with the fact that it hit on all the topics, and that of all days, Juneteenth, it would be so poignant that this discussion be started on Juneteenth, which was supposed to be the emancipation of slaves. But neither here nor there. What I was saying was Dr. John Henry Clark had reference to restore what we have lost. And we have lost generations and generations and generations of original people, of a connection to original people in Africa. We've lost generations of our culture. We've lost generations of our indigenous practices, our beliefs, our storyline, our heritage, our practicum, our foods. We've carried on pieces of it historically over time. But what has been lost is ownership to who we are in terms of being of people of African origin, regardless of where we came from in Africa. Well, regardless, it's important, it's relevant, but just the idea that all of us have lost where we are from because of the idea that we were less than human and that we should serve as labor, free labor, to make white people rich in the United States of America. So today's discussion around reparations to me was very, very important, because it pulled out things that I've been trying to say all along about the truth about the reality that, the prevalence amongst African Americans, the prevalence of victimization amongst African Americans, the attack on African Americans, the fact that we are the most likely to be incarcerated, the fact that we are that we have the profit for prison system, the fact that we have the poorest educational systems, the fact that we are the poorest economically in this country, the fact that we have the deplorable educational conditions, deplorable communities, the fact that we have the most toxic environments to live in. We're often put near industrial sites or sites that are filled with carcinogenics. The fact that we have the highest mortality rate amongst infant mortality rate, the highest mortality rate amongst childbirth. The fact that we have the highest rate of men dying from various diseases because we have communities that are food deserts or deprived of healthy nutritional foods. The fact that our country intentionally imposed on us divisive strategies or imposed on us economic disadvantages, intentionally compromised, and still to this day, when I reference to these things, still to this day, go above and beyond in terms of discriminatory practices as it relates to loans, discriminatory practices as it relates to financing businesses or business ventures, discriminatory practices as it relates to higher interest rates, not giving fair lending practices, not giving fair housing practices, not affording us even equal rights when it comes to things like what we do in terms of our hair when we work in certain places, for God's sakes. I mean, the list goes on and on and on and on of what has been and continues to be systemically diseased mentality of white supremacist invasion against people of color. So today's discussion about HR 40 is just the very, very, very beginning of, most importantly, revealing the truth about what has gone on historically against people of color, brown and black people of color in this country for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. It not only is, as was mentioned, about addressing this history, but addressing what currently is happening economically, socially, psychologically, physiologically to people of color, and the consequences and how that has rolled out long term, and how generationally it has affected us and kept us at the bottom tier. So for me, today was hands down a step in the right direction. Did I hear ignorances? Yes. Did I hear white people who want to continue to justify that reparations have been done and argue that affirmative action, even though it was pointed out that white women were the beneficiaries, the majority of white women were the beneficiaries of affirmative action, that we can't impose on this generation what past generations did. We cannot say that the blood is on the hands of this generation. What we can say is that the green is on the hands of this generation that benefited from our sweat, our backs, black people's labor, black people's intelligence, black people's invention, black people's ingenious, their survivalist attitude and will to endure the most deplorable, sickening, vile, incorrigible experiences during enslavement. And what we can say is that based on our blood, our sweat, our pain, our suffering, our knowledge, our science, our understanding of engineering, our understanding of astronomy, our understanding of medicine, our understanding of all of the greatness that has been taken from African history and African identity and brought here to this country. People of Caucasians have benefited from in green. So the blood isn't in the palm of this generation's hands, but the green is in the palm of this generation's hands. And if you think about it from that standpoint, our suffering has been to the gain of Caucasian people. And so this discussion is not just about how we get paid financially, because I, for one, believe that it's a lot more than any monetary profit. I believe that we do have to address the systemic the systemic breakdown and the systemic damage that continues to attack us. I personally believe that we have to do a system overhaul. I personally believe that we have to do a judicial overhaul. I personally believe we have to do a policing overhaul. I personally believe we have to do a housing overhaul. We have to do a fair lending practices overhaul. We have to change the laws as to what discrimination looks like and what the consequences are to discrimination going forward. We have to make sure that there are protections put in place that ensure that every generation to follow never suffers the victimization or the vile acts that were imposed against people of color. It's a collective discipline. That's really what it comes down to. This discussion about reparations is a collective discipline. It's a time in history where we make a concerted effort to people of color come together, speak about our issues, bring voice to our pain, our hardships, our suffering, the injustices that were imposed upon us. But what it does more importantly, in my opinion, is it affords white people and people of other cultures who have been intentionally kept in the dark about the victimization of people of color, intentionally denied the truth about people of color and what black and brown people have suffered and continue to endure. I think that is really what they are speaking about. If we can collectively and cumulatively have a formal platform in which to roll out that truth, lay out the truth, all the consequences to date, all the damage psychosocially, emotionally, economically to date, and then peel back the ugly poison, the rotten core of what racism really is about and why it was even formed and how it was formed, in terms of the denial of truth, in terms of the denial of accurate education and accurate facts about enslavement, in terms of the unfair practices, the violence, the imprisons, the prison for profit, and again, I don't want to be redundant and repeat myself, because a lot was said, and I do recommend that everybody goes back and watches it, because there are so many poignant statements made by very, very thorough, well-studied professionals that would run circles around anything that I'm trying to say right now. But they spoke beautifully to the statistics, beautifully to the hardships, beautifully to the pain and the suffering that we have had to been subject to. When you look at this whole idea of reparations, I implore every single one of you all listening, thank you for listening in, to number one, watch the video, and number two, be informed enough so that you can have open, eloquent, intelligible conversations with people who are in opposition or whom are confused about what reparations is for us, what it means for people of color in this country, because it certainly is not about a handout. it is certainly not about a hand up, because from where I stand and where I sit, we should have never been in a position where we had to ask for a handout or had to ask for a handout. We are asking for what every human being has a right to, which is safety, protections, security, an inalienable right to freedoms and voice under the laws of this land. Okay, so don't get it twisted. Thank you, cuz. How you doing? Don't get it twisted. For me, I couldn't give a rat's ass about your dollar. Okay, because it's our dollar. It was always our dollar. It was our dollar to begin with, because everything that we did in terms of, agriculture, in terms of invention, in terms of everything from the street light to the hair comb to the ironing board to the elevator, anything that related to servitude. If you look at history, we as people of color are behind that. So the dollar is ours. It should have been ours. And as far as I'm concerned, every black person in this country should be given shares, stocks, across the board, to every corporation that currently profits in the billions off of our genius or our sweat or our pain or our suffering. I'm getting emotional for some reason, and I think it's because finally we're in a place where we're even able to have this damn discussion, something that should have been the wrongs that should have been righted a long time ago. And also, I pray that when they start to peel back the layers, they see that the ugly core, the rotten core of this subject matter rests in a racist government, a government of leaders that wore KKK hoods behind closed doors, and to this day wear those hoods. They just wear them behind closed doors. I mean, we currently have a standing president that will and does willingly speak out in favor of racism, in favor of KKK, in favor of segregation, and vile practices, encouraging racism in the media, encouraging racism in policing, encouraging, that somehow there's two sides to every story when a car plows down a street and murder people, all in the name of white Aryan rights. So I don't want to I really don't want to get off on tangents. I want to try to keep my focus as to what is relevant, and what is relevant is the discussion is underway. But what's more relevant is that this is only a discussion about a discussion. And what I want everybody to keep in mind is that HR 40 means they are just posing the idea of a commission to discuss how to repair the damages of ADOS, African descendants of slavery. Just a discussion, a bill for a discussion on how to repair. This is not everything goes right down to, through the House and to the Senate. And yes, everybody's going to get reparations and repair for all the damages done historically. This is just to start a discussion. So what I need everybody to understand, when this ends, don't remain silent. Share the information. Don't remain silent. Pass on the truth. Don't remain silent. Make sure that your council and your Congress and your senators understand you stand by this 150%. I just posted something in my page about the importance of petitions. 100,000 names on a petition does in fact go to the floor for consideration. It does invite people to come and speak their voice, and change.org and things like that. So sign those petitions, because those petitions do speak to the masses. And as long as we are involved in speaking to the masses and saying, no, we don't want, or yes, we do want, or no, we won't stand by those petitions when we can't physically be present, they're heard. That's something that I put there intentionally. There was also this discussion about a kind of random question was asked about what would Jesus do? Well, historically, throughout time, we have had religious, what would be the best way to describe Jesus or Christ in relationship to all of the historical significant greats? I would almost call them aberrations. They were divinely ordered, above and beyond average human beings that came to amount to something great that would shift history and make change. And a question was posed about that, and the response was not so much about Jesus, but whether or not we have moral conscience. And reparations is about identifying whether or not this country has a moral conscience, identifying whether or not this country is committed to engaging in moral correctness. We can truly, I believe, say as human beings that to fail one is to fail all. And I would argue that the common good for some, if not given to all, means that we are all failures to one another. And I would also argue, based in part on things that Dr. Clark said about the abuses against people of color, the abuses against women and men, the abuses against children in this country, the vile mistreatment. Again, we are the poorest. We are the most imprisoned. We are the least likely to get a fair and equal education. We are the least likely to get loans. We are the least likely to have advantages. We are the ones that have been directed to labor jobs instead of pursuing higher education. My son was at the top tier, in the top tier of nationally. His school, Teaneck High School, was at the top tier, in the top 3% nationally in terms of the highest GPA scores ever, historically. But he was at the bottom of the top tier, and the counselor wanted to direct him to a community college. That's discriminatory practice. So when you peel back the layers of what discrimination looks like, when you send a white child to apply to an Ivy League school, and you'll send a black child to apply to a community college, and you tell them each that they have a different potential outlook for their futures, that is discriminatory practices. And it happens all across this country every single day to our children in America. Our children are more likely to be suspended. Our children are more likely to be directed to from school to prisons. Our children are more likely to drop out. Our children are more likely to suffer from depression. Our children are more likely to suffer from psychological and psychosis. Our children are more likely to be directed to take some kind of a medication for ADHD, or diagnosed or misdiagnosed with attention deficit, or different types of emotional, social, psychological behaviors, some of which may be justified because they are suffering. It was mentioned that our children have the highest prevalence of fatherless homes. Our children have the highest percentage of victimization. So, across the board, most likely to be profiled by police, most likely to be attacked by police, most likely to be victimizations of violence. This is just our generation. So when you look at reparations, don't just look at the past and what the past has done to compromise everything going forward to the present. Look at the damage that's done now, and how that damage is going to take several generations to repair. Several generations to repair going forward. This is beyond massive, and it is an undertaking that will take commitment, hard work. It will take balancing out emotions. It'll take swallowing pills that a lot of people are not ready to swallow. It'll definitely take as mentioned in the committee discussions, it'll definitely take Caucasian people or people of other ethnic groups, emotional and psychological work to process, number one, that they've been lied to, in the way that African Americans we've known for centuries, hundreds of years. We've known since the beginning the truth. It's not our job to learn the truth, except for those who had the disadvantages of never having it taught to them. It's our job to reinforce and reiterate the truth. And it is everybody else's job to learn the truth. It is everybody else's job to hear it, to absorb it, to use all the senses, and to take it in such a way that it as someone was mentioning, heals us from the inside out, and helps us to understand we as people of color were failed by moral indifference. We were failed. We were destroyed by moral indifference. And moral indifference speaks to us as human beings, not just as white people, but people in general. We've failed, and we have been failing in the most drastic, devastatingly abusive ways possible. When I look online every day and I see people under attack, people being murdered in mosques, in temples, in across the country, when we endorse guns, and there was something referenced to, even that. People of color didn't have the power to bring drugs into their community. They didn't have the financial means to bring drugs into their community. They didn't have the financial means to bring alcohol into their communities. They didn't have the financial means to put bodegas on every corner and sell toxic foods. We didn't have those means. We didn't have the means to own the properties that would be filled with asbestos and filled with lead and filled with carcinogenics. We didn't have that means. This is all part of that disease, that underlying disease that has been consequential generation after generation after generation. So without dragging through the mud of all of the sick things that have been done intentionally to people of color, because I post that every day, and it's happening right now. I post videos every single day in the CMTY Solutions page every day of what's happening to people. I walk through Harlem streets and see the consequences when I see in every street corner a black male sleeping on a corner, or nodded over in drugs, or out of his mind in mental illness. I don't need to repeat that. All you have to do is look for it yourselves and you'll see it. What I do want to emphasize is that without your voice, without you signing the petitions, without you agreeing that this is a necessary evil, it's a painful, difficult, vile emotion that everyone has to go through to deal with truth, and that it forces us to look in the mirror as human beings and see what's wrong with us. And by doing that, as it relates to reparations for African Americans, we can begin to start to consider it as it relates to all those people who have been victims of oppression and colonization and white supremacy over hundreds of years. And maybe by challenging us to look at these difficult things and discuss these difficult things, it'll help us to rebalance our moral compass as it relates to each other and as it relates to the world. I am a product of many different cultures. My dominant culture, because of what influenced me, was my African American experience. I was raised hearing about the injustices. I was eyewitness to the day that King got shot when my grandfather screamed out. I saw my father and my uncles struggling and speaking and listening to them with a small mind about the Black Panthers movement and how they were being infiltrated by the FBI and the CIA and the murdered, and that kind of thing, that kind of surveillance still happens today. And it has been stated emphatically by the FBI in recent interviews that there is no proof that any black organization, the Black Lives Movement, the Black Panthers movement, or any organizations of recent have done anything violent or posed or suggested any threat to the society. But yet, we don't have laws in place that reference to domestic terrorism for all of the white Aryan groups and white organizations that intend to do harm, who do make threats of bombs, who do go in and spray bullets in churches and mosques, who do spray bullets in crowds against LGBT and against blacks and against Hispanics. So it's this imbalance. It's all these imbalances that need to be checked. And it's all these imbalances that the law has to change. And the law has to say, we have to say together cumulatively, we're going to fix it. And we're going to fix it from the inside out. And we're not going to let this shit go on anymore. Period. End of subject. Do I believe it's all going to happen overnight? Absolutely. You shredded an entire race of people has been shredded to the bone. Their flesh. The bone is exposed on us. Spiritually, emotionally, psychologically, and economically. You don't heal that in 1 or 2 meetings. You don't heal that with $2,000 given to every single black person in this country. You don't heal that. You strip it apart. You go into the bone. You look at where the infection is. You cut away the infection. You put antibiotics in the infection. You give it some time to heal, and then you sew up the wound. It's not an overnight thing. It's not an overnight thing. But I can rest assured that in spite of whether or not we are in a place of having the power to make these changes and influence the Senate to do what it needs to do, just the mere fact that this conversation is open, just the mere fact that there is dialogue about reparations, just the mere fact that it is in a public format, just the mere fact that each one of us has an opportunity to walk away, view the information ourselves, empower ourselves with the knowledge and the facts, share that information with other people, is the beginning of healing. And I'm referencing not just to people of color, I'm referencing to one another, I'm referencing to the people that work at your job, and saying in your intimate, your coffee clutch, hey, would you all be interested in coming by one day and sitting down and watching a forum, a discussion about systemic racism, or the 13th, or any other documentaries that discuss what is wrong with this country and how we can begin to repair it? That's the beginning of change. That's the beginning of healing. That's the beginning of us moving to something better. And again, I repeat, it is because I was acculturated to understand my black experience, understand the victimization, and also understand that as such, even my grandmother, who married a black man in a time when whites were not supposed to marry black men, it was unheard of. Her own husband, who happened to be embraced by a white community, an all-white Italian community, didn't know he was black until he went into the military. And he was in the army, and he was in the Korean War, and the first time he was reminded that he had brown skin was in the military, when he was defending this country, and he was put on the back of the bus. And because he resisted being treated in a subservient manner, he spent most of the time in the brig. And when he came back, even though he became a fireman, and even though he was still embraced in certain places in society, he could no longer have a relationship with his white counterpart, because the treatment imposed on him was so vile and so sick and so cruel that he couldn't connect with the woman that he had fallen in love with any longer. So, it's some deep shit. It's deep, and it's costly, and it's damaging, and that's what reparations is about, looking at the extent of the damage. So I'm just going to point out the words, okay? They talked about history, they talked about organized labor, they talked about predatory practices, they talked about discrimination, they talked about redlining and the injustices as it relates to shutting down ballots, voting booths and the ballots, and not allowing us to vote. They talked about the deplorable environmental attacks against people of color, the fact that you actually have people living in communities with poison and carcinogenics, and our children are drinking water. That alone, Flint, when you talk about Flint, when you talk about all these communities out here around the country, when you talk about the generational trauma, a big one, generational trauma, that is prevalent in how our families can't come together. It is prevalent in how we function as broken, and many of us cannot have a home with two-parent households. That many of our people suffer from addictions and codependencies, or a mental illness. They talked about again, lending practices, selling up and lying to people and making believe. 1/3 of the economists said 1/3 of African Americans were lied to and told that they wouldn't be able to get traditional loans, and got set up with these kind of buyback loans where basically they could have their homes taken back. They talked about Jim Crow, and and again the redlining, and the reason that to this day we suffer from some of the things that we suffer from. They talked about how when our communities, we functioned independently and we built our own from the inside out, and we had Black Wall Street and places like that all over the country, how white men decided that they did not want us to have more, and they walked into these communities and destroyed everything, burnt everything down. They talked about our invention. They talked about how whites don't yet identify with the common cause, and how important it is that we discuss the common cause, and that we relate to one another as a common cause, and that ultimately whites cannot begin to, people of Caucasian descent or European descent can't even begin to heal or deal with their own guilt, or deal with their own misgivings, or their own shame, their emotional trauma, until we have these discussions and we start to work through these problems. They talked about the mundane complacency. There was a wonderful thing said about, basically the idea that this discussion and the potential for HR 40 to go through, and then the potential for us to actually speak about repairing psychologically, socially, emotionally, spiritually, physically, economically, is a soulful act that would speak to not just people of whites, as it relates to people of color, but as cumulatively, as a common goal for Americans to commit to a soulful act of healing, which I thought was a poignant way to kind of close out portions of it. There certainly was discussion about domestic workers, the wealth of whites comparatively to blacks, and again the numbers are very specific. The redlining, they talked about the zip codes that are segregated to impose the most harshest of penalties, the most harshest of systemic racism on, to keep the thumb, or in most cases the foot, on the necks of black and white and brown people. I, again, look at the CMTY Solutions page. I intentionally put as much information and data in there as possible. 57,000 black and brown women and children, girls, are missing in this country. It's not being talked about. I just posted that another 5,700 Native American women have disappeared. It's not being talked about. I posted the prevalence of depression amongst our children, the data about how many of us are in prison, the data about how many of us are targeted for prison, the data about the attacks across the board. The numbers are astronomical. And especially it was Dr. Marver, I believe, that really did a wonderful job of talking about the economic consequence and how that economic consequence kind of separated those in positions of servitude. So anybody who was working as a household maid or a butler or working in the farms never even had the benefits of a Social Security check. They talked about the whole cash bond system and how we have men and women and children currently in the system because their families can't bail them out, who will stay there indefinitely just because they cannot bail them out. I don't think, again, and I must emphasize, I don't think this is a quick fix. I think this is about the dialogue. And I think that as long as everybody understands that HR 40 is about the agreement that our country will commit, our government will commit to dialogue. Our government will commit to doing accurate, effective research to understand why we are the greatest to suffer in this country, and how systemic racism has been the cause of the disease, literally and figuratively in this country. And what everybody has to do is sign whatever petitions there are to make sure that that discussion continues. What everybody has to do is make sure that that dialogue continues. Everyone has to do is go back and know the facts and know the truth and be ready to engage white counterparts, their people, your friends, your neighbors, your families, even your loved ones in some instances, and talk to them about those facts and that truth, and be on the same page with that. Don't assume that because this discussion is happening and underway that it just means by osmosis everything is going to fix itself overnight. We cannot continue to pass the buck on to somebody else. We cannot continue to pass the job onto somebody else. We are the people. We are this country. We are its citizens. And as was eloquently pointed out, this is our home. This is all we know. And we struggle as people of color every day to try to fit, to try to make a place, to try to become part of the country, not just as visitors or guests or those who are somehow invited when we weren't. We were stolen and brought here. We don't want that. What we want is to be able to claim the same ownership equally in every sense that every other human being has, every other person has, that inalienable right in any place around the world. And we're just asking for the same here. And I think that's the message that has to come across. And I think that's the most important piece of this formula. This is the time. This is the time right now for all of us. We have an opportunity, and what we make a mistake of far too many times is we let somebody else do the work for us. Somebody else be the voice for us. Somebody else be the advocates. Somebody else be the activist. Somebody else be the change maker. Somebody else push back. And everything, education, the prison system, gentrification, prevalence of death, mortality, sickness, prisons, in the environment, everything has to be discussed. Everything. What kind of programs we are going to put in place to ensure that every generation going forward does not suffer the way generations past and generations present have. And on one sidebar note, if we really do the soul work, that does not mean we will put our Hispanic migrants in the place of African Americans and treat them the way we were treated. Because then what we've done is we have lost, again, our soul. So in closing, keep that in mind. This is not about kicking somebody else in the car to the curb or stepping on somebody else's neck so that we can somehow get ahead and live better. I don't believe that the idea that there always has to be somebody at the bottom, because everyone has access, if given. Everyone can have access to everything that they need to survive and function and maintain livable, dignified conditions in this country and in this world. So I've really spoken way too long, but I implore everybody, do your part, speak out, do your homework, watch that video, and stay very close to what's happening with HR 40 and be ready to push back if they resist HR 40 when it hits the floor. Be ready to push back and push back hard, because this is going to dictate everything that's going forward in our future. And there's a young man that I listen to occasionally. He's a police officer in our community talk radio, and he said, and he's also been in politics, and he's trying to run for office again, and he said emphatically, things are going to get worse for black people in this country. But as a police officer, his observation and the things that the precedents that you're trying to set right now is only going to darken our doorways if we don't do what we need to do now to become part of those solutions. And there's a sense of urgency. We're at mass destruction. Every scholar has spoken. People of color are at mass destruction. And not to mention human beings are at mass destruction if we don't do anything to save our planet. But the fact that he, as an intelligent young black male police officer, is saying, I'm worried for us. That means he's worried for himself as well. He's worried for his job as well. He's worried that if he fights outside of the blue code of silence, he ultimately can also be a victim. So my passion, my commitment, my urgency, my voice comes from that inner maternal, that inner, sixth sense, third eye, God to source, source to God thing that says, we have to do something. I'm worried. It's desperate times cause for desperate measures. So don't fall asleep on this just because it's open for discussion, please. Thank you all for always listening. Thank you all for always supporting. Hey, Michael, how are you? Richard, thanks for your support always. Vincent, how's it going? Hey, Maurice. No, we are going to stay positive. And that's the other thing. Maurice and I were having a discussion about the idea of triggering a war. Tulsi Gabbard right now is really trying her hardest to put a bill before the floor that would stop any standing president from having exclusive rights to start a war without the voice of the people, i.e. the Congress. So support that bill also, because otherwise we're going to end up in a war, and more of our black and brown men are going to end up dead in that war. And this war could go on for years and years and years and years and be unending. So that's another place where your voice needs to be loud and your voice needs to be clear if you want to protect not only your sons, your grandsons, and your great-grandsons, because this could be a war that never ends. It really could be. And so we have to stop this crazy man, because the other thing is that if he starts a war, a standing president during a war can maintain his position and stay in office, for those of you who didn't know that. Ed, I love you. You've always been one of my best buddies. You're my Justin Timberlake of Teaneck. I tease you about that. But anyway, I love you and thank you for the support. Willie, thank you as well, always. Hopefully I'll see you over in Harlem soon. Rhonda, thank you. Oh my goodness, Chris, and of course William, Roy, thank you. I love you. Dina, I know you're over there doing missionary work in Africa all the time. Well, we need some of your missionary work right here in this country, because we got a lot of broken pieces that need to be put back together. Moon, my partner in crime at graduation, always standing by me. I love you for that. Jean, thank you. Victor, and of course my family in Bermuda, thank you as well. And I definitely have more to say, but I'm not going to talk anymore because I have a job to do, and I'm going to do that right now. So peace, namaste, love, be safe, watch your backs, watch out for your women and your children. There's some serious shit going on out here. Watch out for your women and watch out for your children, and encourage everybody to travel in packs, everyone, and encourage everybody to know their rights, everyone, and encourage everybody to know the law, the constitutional rights. Encourage everybody to have their phones charged and ready to videotape and ready to show up for one another and protect each other on these streets, because we are under attack, especially now that we are finding our voice and being given a voice. Peace, love, talk to you.